In the alchemiculture philosophy, there are 7 polar aspects of humanity that we need to look at if we hope to transform ourselves and the world around us. These are cosmology and philosophy, law and justice, economics and currency, citizenship and social dynamics, agriculture and ecology, science and technology, and healing and medicine. In this podcast, we're going to talk about these topics. We're going to expose ideas that can help inspire an alchemical transformation of our culture, one listener at a time. Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this Alchemiculture episode. I am your host, Phoenix Aurelius, and today I am joined by Kyle Peche, who has a really amazing story. Actually, he reached out to us and said, "Hey, look, I've heard of your work and other things, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about detoxification and heavy metals and opening up our intrinsic personality and all sorts of other cool things like this." And of course, this is right up our alley, and I figured this would make a great conversation. So I'm very happy to welcome to the show Kyle Peche. Thank you so much for joining us, man. How are you doing today?
I'm really good, man. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really stoked for this conversation.
Yeah, likewise, me too. Now, I've heard just a little bit about your own personal story. I started diving into a couple of podcasts and just kind of knowing, who it is that I'm talking with in general. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story. From what I understand, like from a relatively early age, you had kind of suffered with some severe toxicities that were manifesting lots of different areas of your life and your personality and in your behavior and in your neurology and other different types of things like this. So tell us a little bit more about that. Like what did your story kind of begin with here that got you down this path?
Well, it began actually, quite frankly, before I was even born, where my mother had a strange set of neurological symptoms that no doctor could figure out. And she was bouncing around for years and years and years and years and years. They thought it was MS, but it was just very bizarre. A lot of behavioral stuff, weird fainting spells, dysautonomia, all that kind of stuff, right? And she actually had about 8 amalgam fillings, right?
Yeah,
And never
there you
made
go.
that connection to, potential mercury toxicity. But several years later, I was born, you know, and I wasn't necessarily unhealthy in my youth, but I always felt strangely disconnected, strangely withdrawn, shy, and not able to really perform at my best in whatever I tried. So it's like I could never really unlock that flow state, that deep flow
Totally.
state where I would be my max creativity and my max presence. And this continued on throughout up until high school, where even as an athlete, I felt, I was playing soccer for my high school, and it was quite challenging to reach that next level. And I also felt exhausted outside of it and depressed and kind of like I was floating above my body. Up until about 18, my health just collapsed seemingly overnight. It was some emotional trauma that finally did me in, again, relating to my
Yeah,
mother and other stuff, right? Straw that broke the camel's back,
yeah.
I
That's what I was
suppose.
gonna say. Yeah.
Yeah. So, overnight it seemed, my gut completely destroyed. I could only tolerate about 3 or 4 foods. Anything I ate really would give me brain fog for weeks. And I felt so absolutely disassociated and disconnected to the world and people around me that I couldn't hold a normal conversation. I couldn't hold the job. I literally was completely debilitated. I had panic attacks. I had uh, crippling anxiety. I slept most of the day. And I mean, I had dozens of other symptoms, which, I'm sure if I keep scouting my memory, I'll remember what they were, but it's quite a
Sure.
lot, right? And I know you had a similar story as well, uh, but yeah. Anyways, it was quite a lot to deal with at that age, just because I'm
Uh,
supposed to be in my peak, I'm supposed to be about to thrive and going to college, but quickly I just became obsessed with figuring out what the hell was wrong with me. So 6 to 7 years of obsessing about health. I mean, that's all I thought about. That's all I researched. That's all I tried. That's all I spent my money on, the little money I had. I didn't talk about anything else. I didn't do anything else. That's all I immersed my mind into. So I went down every possible, at least to me, diet rabbit hole, every kind of naturopath and functional medicine practitioner I could find, conventional as well at first, although that failed me really quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, the more ancient sciences like Ayurveda and a traditional Chinese medicine as well. And I just, I kept having this repeating pattern of I would try something, I'd feel a little better, I'd start raving about it, and then I'd be right back to where I started or worse. And this applied to all the herbs, the anti-parasitics, and all the different things that I was embarking on until I finally I had a breaking point really, and I had to just kind of surrender my own ability to handle my health. I just kind of was crying and praying that I needed a solution, and I couldn't figure what the hell it was. So I got invited to a Zoom call, funny enough, with a bunch of other healers, and one of them told me about mineral balancing, uh, and that to me kind of made a light bulb go off. I was so obsessed with attacking my own body, trying to get rid of stuff, trying to really just remove all the garbage, but I hadn't been focused enough on actually rebuilding my body from the ground up. And that's what made the light bulb go off for me. So I reached out, I found a practitioner, absolutely changed my life in about 3 months. I had enough energy to start living again. I had my symptoms started going away. My brain fog started slowly going down, and I pretty quickly started integrating all the other tools I had learned in detoxification and immune balancing and all that kind of things along the way together. And about, a year and a half later, I was starting to live my dream life. I mean, I found the love of my life. I moved to the West Coast. I had energy to be, performing gigs as a drummer and, playing soccer again and maintaining a joyful life, quite frankly, a joyful life and feeling what it's like to actually have well-being flow through me and have sharp senses and have flow states, which were so foreign to me. I didn't know what it felt like to be in a flow state for most of my life. So that's
Nice, man.
most of it.
Well, very good work on actually being able to go through the research and diving in as much as you did. I know that most people that I have been associated with and that I am familiar with, they kind of tend to do the same thing. I mean, sometimes that happens after years of allopathy and kind of traditional medicine or even naturopathic medicine or what they call integrated medicine, all this shit. Um, Kind of failing them, then they start to kind of do their research. And it's usually this really, really slow process. And same thing, one of the common patterns that we see is like you get a little bit of benefit. And it's like, yes, this is awesome. This is so cool. You got to check out this thing, or, Ayurveda is so rad and blah, 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 and all these other things. But quickly they tend to plateau. And like you said, like either you end up reverting and it's like, well, it made a little bit of difference for a little while, but maybe not so much. I plateaued. Or like you said, sometimes things get worse. um and this is one of the things that I talk about a lot, Kyle, is like how Chinese medicine and Ayurveda are, in some cases, I would call them museum medicine for most practitioners. And what I mean by that is that they are time honored traditions that are still practicing as if we're vastly in the past. Um, you know, nowhere inside of Ayurveda, nowhere inside of Chinese medicine does it talk about how various foods that we are not ancestrally really used to, like how many of us really grew up in Peru eating potatoes where they're actually indigenous? Almost all of us are the result of Spanish people taking the potatoes to Europe and taking them to Asia and taking them to Africa and other things, and introducing foods that epigenetically have no link whatsoever with our DNA or with our ancestors or whatever. And in very short periods of time, in the 1500s, again in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, and now today with global commerce and trade, we're eating all of these foods from all over the world. And regardless of how they're grown and how quote unquote clean they might be, which most foods are not clean in any way, shape, or form, we're still dealing with this crazy epigenetic thing. And traditions like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, whatever else, have classified the tastes and the flavors, but there's still no acknowledgement of the epigenetic alterations that are likely to happen as a result of these types of foods in our diet and so many other things. So I look at them with great respect. And of course, I've learned a great deal about Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and use many of the different types of techniques and flavor profiles and herbs and all sorts of other things. People who know me know that I've dived really deep into those systems, but at the same time, they tend to be for an audience realistically that is not exposed to all of the same toxins and conditions that we are today. How do we use our tea, for instance, in order to create complete resistance against EMFs? We don't have the Taoist masters these days that are so acutely aware of their internal systems and have the ability to contrast what does this feel like where there's no cell signals, no synthetic radiation, EMF radiation at all, and how does that feel versus when we're exposed to EMF like in a city environment or even these days in a country environment where we're just being inundated with all these things. And so these museum type medicines I feel are largely awesome in the ways that humanity has kind of evolved for a long time. They're very useful forms of medicine in certain ways, and they're also not current enough. They're not living traditions. They are museum-like pieces. You get taught like most of the formulations, especially in Chinese medicine, have not really advanced much since like the 1700s. And that indicates that the style is just being repeated, not really being evolved at the present moment. It's not a living tradition anymore. So yeah, I can appreciate a lot of the things that you were saying there.
Are you one of our listeners that struggle with odd health symptoms like anxiety, brain fog, poor sleep, headaches, hormone dysregulation, gut dysbiosis, joint muscle pain, autoimmune conditions, or any other host of seemingly unrelated symptoms? If so, listen up because this is for you. I want you to start checking out the Dr. Pompa Cellular Detox Program. It's a program that I recommend to people who write into my business inquiring about health recommendations because my own IDF wellness research waitlist is several years long, so I love having this trusted and effective cell detox program that I can refer people to. This program addresses the root causes of most people's health struggles, which come down usually to toxins and cell inflammation. Now, while the program is an investment in terms of both time and money, if you're seriously struggling with your health and you're at a dead end, this is probably the answer that you've been looking for. If you check our affiliate link attached to this episode in the description below, you'll be taken to a clickbait type style webinar. And yeah, I know I personally detest that style of marketing too, but I have vetted Dr. Pompa and his program for many, many years, and I feel really good about what they have to offer. As many of you know, I'm only affiliated with companies that I myself stand behind 100%. So if this speaks to you, I recommend sitting through that webinar and then following the steps to become enrolled in their program if it feels right for you. By using our affiliate link, you help the podcast and our research academy. Thanks so much.
So I'm really curious though. So what was kind of one of the major determining factors for you being able to turn around your health and being able to turn around your wellness?
Well, first of all, I want to just briefly say I really love the views you just shared. I've actually naturally gravitated towards eating ancestrally. My my ancestry is all from Venezuela and Latin America, and I've just generally found that once I healed to be able to tolerate all foods, that the foods I grew up with were the ones that I do best with.
Totally.
So I share the same thing with my clients now. As well, I mean, I love what you said about things not being these old ancient systems not being living medicine. They're not really synchronized with the present moment anymore. And I think that just actually speaks to how a lot of what's going on today has the same root causes for people. So a lot of people have brain related issues. A lot of people have anxiety related issues. A lot of people have gut related issues. And a lot of this is because it's the same environmental stressors. The EMF's absolutely huge, 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 huge. But different toxicants in our environment, like glyphosate destroying people's guts, the aluminum that everyone's breathing in, and I find in pretty much everyone's hair test, has a
Yeah.
huge impact on our cognition and, even our brain volume. So it's kind of these systems. I would love to just see them reapplied in a way that is relevant to today and addressing these issues, like, modern pachakarma, for example.
Yes.
Yogic purification is what a lot of people need, and that is not something that is really talked about too much in Ayurveda today, unfortunately. But yeah, so to answer your question as well, for me, what really turned my health around was mineral balancing as the foundation, which I can dive a little bit more into, is really just a science of balancing the body's biochemistry with different minerals, vitamins, and glandulars. It's a science that was developed by Dr. Paul Eck over about 50 to 60 years of research and analyzing millions of hair tests, hair mineral analysis specifically. It's all about, again, giving the body essentially what it needs in certain biochemical patterns so it has the most energy to heal itself, if I were to describe it in the most simple of terms, right? So that's a phenomenal foundation. And that really made all the difference in terms of restoring my energy levels and giving my body the resilience and vitality it needed to heal itself. And then layering on top of that is addressing these toxins that are pervasive. So, the pesticides that destroy the guts, the heavy metals that warp and twist and damage our nervous system so we don't express our true selves and instead are being refracted through this weird warped consciousness, is how I look at heavy metals. Or the fluoride that's impacting the brain and sleep cycles in many different ways. So um, I find that layering the mineral balancing with the detoxification in various stages, that is what changed my life. And that is now the system I share with people. Mineral balancing the way through, and then different stages, addressing things in a correct order of operations to properly purify their bodies. And just kind of briefly on that, that could start with, for example, restoring the gut lining and purifying it of pesticides that don't allow our natural microbiome to thrive.
Yeah.
And then opening up the liver, again, giving it the right nutrients it needs, helping, improve that bile flow and the conjugation of toxins in the liver. So you can actually have it cleansing your blood again. And then slowly starting to get things out of the cells in the lymphatic system. Right.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yes. All of those things. And even that order is really important and something that I work with my clients as well. Yeah, I came to that conclusion after working with hundreds and hundreds of clients and doing things in different ways and split testing it, seeing which way is actually going to create the very best. And of course, most people will go kind of straight to the liver, and they oftentimes will end up with things like SIBO or IMO, intestinal methanogen overgrowth or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, if they address the liver first. Because once you get your bile flowing properly, one of the biggest problems with that is that it creates a highly acidic environment inside of the intestines that most bacteria are not going to be able to be resilient to, leaving only intestinal methanogen overgrowth, the archaea inside of the gut, to be able to thrive inside of that because they're an extremophile, and creating all these problems. And of course, if you go to allopaths or even naturopaths or functional medicine practitioners, they wrongly prescribe antibiotics, which really don't do anything for archaea. They just destroy whatever beneficial bacteria colonies are existing inside of a biofilm there. And it's just this really bad cycle. So it's really cool to hear about that, and also about the remineralization. I think this is an important point because in today's kind of alternative crowd, your yoga people and all the other shit that you see, there's such an emphasis, and has been for like the last 20 years, on detox, 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 detox. And half the time, what I'm seeing is that people have detoxed and become so deficient that even when the toxins are gone, they feel just as bad, if not worse, as when the toxins were there, because there's such a vast deficiency inside of the system that they just can't really process things. And so to hear you say, successive detox protocol and getting like you mentioned, glyphosate and 2,4-D and other different types of very common pesticides out of the tissues, especially of the stomach, of the small intestine, of the large intestine, so critically important. Most people don't realize this, but even just eating a tiny bit of glyphosate is going to take all of the tight junctions inside of the intestines, of course, and just completely make them ultra loose and start allowing food particles, bacteria, archaea, fungi, all of these critically important parts of the microbiome now into the bloodstream. And when glyphosate gets to the blood-brain barrier, it breaks down the blood-brain barrier, allowing so many of these heavy metal toxins and other poisons that are also present inside of our food, but they're present inside of our water, inside of our air, getting now into the bloodstream and into the brain, where they otherwise would not have ever had that opportunity, were they not weakened by things. Specifically, glyphosate has perhaps some of the most, the largest studies behind it.
Mhm.
So yeah, man, really, really great. Now I'm curious about the system that you said was created by Paul Eck, right?
Mhm.
Concerning the remineralization. What did that look like for you, and how did you hear about that, and how did you get turned on to all of that?
So again, I love the views you just shared. I briefly do want to say something on that because I really do agree. There is a obsession with really yin based cleansing and detoxification. So emptying and releasing and getting stuff out, even in the way they approach how they're always trying to release their traumas and let go of the past. It's kind of
Yeah,
mirroring on a different level, which I find super funny.
it's true.
Um, but it's I think a short-sighted, misguided approach because we are so mineral deficient due to the depletion of the soils, due to the competitive nature of these different toxins. They want to actually sometimes push our beneficial minerals out, like
Almost
mercury.
always.
Oh,
Almost
pretty
always.
much always. So our first line of defense, our fortress walls are built on our minerals, and that's what actually helps deter the poisons from actually accumulating within us, right? So if you don't have any fortress walls and you keep trying to just remove the garbage, it's just going to get blown back in the second you're exposed to it again,
Yep.
which is what was happening to me, and I didn't realize it when I was doing a lot of, especially, people find out about binders and they just start taking a bunch of charcoal and then they just deplete more of the nutrients.
It's like you
More
can't absorb anything when you're taking high levels of charcoal.
Absolutely. And
All
that
being
that
absorbed.
really, really depleted me too. And it was a hard lesson to learn, and something I try to shortcut people from dealing with. But it's so vital. Like, mercury will actually displace selenium from the selenoproteins in our brain, and then damage different antioxidant systems, right? Or aluminum will compete with silica in our collagen and then actually contribute to more wrinkles and damaged connective tissue. Or glyphosate will compete with not a mineral but glycine, actually not only in our digestive enzymes but also in our connective tissue. And so there's just wearing down of the body simply due to not having, quite frankly, the right nutrients on board to deal with the toxic onslaught. And of course, it's more complicated than just that. There's also like the emotional and mental component that creates
Sure.
that resiliency, right? But that was a huge point, and I'm really glad you brought it up. Definitely something that needs to be talked about. So, pardon me, what was your question one more time?
Yeah. Was how'd you get turned on to Paul Eck's work and remineralizing?
Yeah, so I had that moment of despair where I ended up going to that Zoom call. I'm trying to keep an open mind, and someone did tell me about mineral balancing, right? They just because I was venting on the call and telling them all about all the stuff I was dealing with and how I thought I was dying, and I felt like I was in, a different dimension and all that stuff. And
Totally.
yeah, and this guy had a very calm, cool, and collected and compassionate demeanor. Something that I rarely see, for someone to be able to hold that space and understand exactly what I was going through as if he had been through it himself, and yet was embodying radiance and vitality, So he had completely understood where I was and just directly said, "Hey, you should check out mineral balancing." So I was put onto it. I found a practitioner online, and really So in terms of how it works and how it looked like for me, it all started off really with sending off a hair mineral analysis to a laboratory. And with that, I found about this is the levels of about 20 different minerals and heavy metals as well. And the focus of it was balancing the major four electrolytes, right? So it's all about calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. The reason why it's so important to balance these specifically is because it is a reflection of what's going on in the body's systems. So our adrenal strength will typically mirror the levels of sodium that we see on a hair test just because of the adrenal hormones, how they influence the levels of sodium in solution, right? Or the strength of our adrenal and thyroid glands will dictate how much we're able to keep calcium and magnesium in solution. So if you have really high levels of calcium and magnesium, it's something we call slow oxidation. It shows that we have a weakened, essentially, energy system in the body. And now we're having calcium and magnesium precipitate into the tissues, which causes all sorts of calcification and all other issues, right? Also an actual losing of the vital minerals that we need, calcium, magnesium, right? So what Dr. Pollack found, again, through his research, is that certain minerals, glandulars, and vitamins would change these ratios, right? Would change the ratio between sodium, potassium, or the ratio between calcium, magnesium. And by doing that, there would actually be an increase in cellular energy. And just to take a step back as well, what he found is that as people got healthier, they tended to keep gravitating to this center point where the minerals and major electrolytes would keep going to the same exact levels and the same exact ratios in everyone as they got healthier and healthier, as they performed better and better, and as they had less and less symptoms, right? So that's where the target was developed from. And so again, he found through certain minerals, vitamins, and glandulars that you would be able to tweak these ratios and people would have more energy and they would start expelling heavy metals. They would start expelling all kinds of other toxins that would then come up on the hair test and you'd be able to track their healing. So again, that's about it in a nutshell. I have found through my own practice that there are different ways of tweaking these ratios as well, right? I mean, even something like changing a person's psychological disposition can actually increase something called the sodium to potassium ratio. Essentially, they call it the life or death ratio because it has a lot to do with the electrical potential of our cells and
Sodium potassium
all that.
pump type of thing. Yeah.
Huge. So Dr. Pollack again called it the life or death ratio or the vitality ratio because it was so important for our immune function, for our nervous system function, and even had connections to the way people behaved in the world. So if they had a really low sodium to potassium ratio, they tended to be withdrawn. If it was really low, it was a very reliable predictor of trauma, past trauma specifically, right? So, and if it was really high, you had the people that were very forward looking, very, if it got really high, very ungrounded and not centered. They were just always obsessed about the next thing. And so the people that were right in the middle were quite frankly, the meditators, right? The ones who are actually really locked in the present moment, which I always found so fascinating. So I found if you just share with people the right kind of practices for them, the right kind of meditation and breathwork techniques for them, that they also are able to balance that ratio and come closer to center, which has all kinds of other effects on our ability to let go of toxins. So
Totally, man. Well, yeah, I think that that's really important. One of the things that I'm interested in is what forms of the minerals were you using? Because when people hear minerals, oftentimes they'll go online, they'll, maybe go to Amazon or go to a place like GNC and then try and find certain minerals like, oh, I'm not sleeping well enough, I need more magnesium. Then they start loading up on magnesium and getting like bisglycinate and, other different types of forms of it that are allegedly more bioavailable. But that also oftentimes can contribute to mineral deficiency as well, based on the balance of other minerals that are being taken or consumed. So, what forms of the minerals were you actually using, and what do you suggest to your clients these days?
So these formulations were developed by Dr. Pollack. So he just found that different biochemical patterns needed certain ratios, certain forms, certain vitamins. So it's kind of hard to all pin it into one.
Sure.
So Endomid is the one that developed a lot of the ratio or a lot of the formulations that Dr. Pollack believed in. And then another company, Valence Nutraceuticals, now has modernized it, keeping the same ratios, but with even more bioavailable forms and doing things that I'm finally really glad that they did, like making sure there's no inactive B6 or B2, which has been very problematic for people.
Totally.
So yeah, it's kind of hard to nail it down into one specific form, but I generally, as much as I can, like to go whole food approach as much as I can first and foremost, because not everyone even actually tolerates the isolated minerals right away. Because again, it can have a huge, diverse amount of effects on the rest of the system, right? And so even if you're giving isolated, let's say iodine, the amount of stuff that you can displace with isolated iodine versus food-based iodine could be a lot more dramatic, right? So it's something definitely that needs to be done with care and under the guidance of a practitioner. I'm not a huge fan of recommending like isolated minerals for people, but yeah. So again, it's kind of hard to answer that question just because there's wide form of different nutrients and minerals, which I encourage people to absolutely look into the formulations and make up their own minds.
Yeah, super cool. Super cool. I think that that's important. Yeah, the reason I asked that is that one of the things that I use over here are angstrom size minerals in their pure ionic form. So instead of having like a magnesium bisglycinate or having, a magnesium chloride or magnesium, any of these other types of minerals, we're isolating magnesium in its ionic form and taking it down to an angstrom size so that it becomes available at the cell level. But it's still important to be able to have ideal balance between what it is that you're taking, because just because it's cellularly bioavailable does not necessarily mean that it's going to take care of the issue that you're looking for it to take care of, unless you can balance it with all of the other different types of minerals that are necessary for that one biological process, or the root imbalance for which somebody might be taking it. So yeah, that was definitely something that I found was kind of interesting. You had mentioned about you utilizing a whole food form. In my experience, when I work with my clients, about 80%, maybe even more than that, but if I just had to come up with a number, I'd say about 80% of people actually have absolutely poor and completely racked gastric parietal cell health, meaning that they're not excreting intrinsic factor, which is going to help them to absorb vitamins B9 and B12 and allow them to utilize iron properly and a number of other things, iron, copper, zinc, selenium, all of the red blood cell builders. But at the same time, they can't even absorb or break down either the proteins, which are, building blocks for just about every type of hormone and neurotransmitter, and pretty much all of the encoding for DNA and other different types of things. And they can't absorb most of their alkalizing minerals, calcium, magnesium, manganese, potassium. Typically, they can use sodium because it's a very, very available type of mineral, and we get a lot more of that than some of these others, just through salting our food and whatever else. But iron, calcium, zinc, all of these others. How often do you encounter that in your practice, and do you have an approach for how you like to address that?
Well, all the time. I mean, again, like I mentioned earlier, most people's gut and quite frankly, their livers as well have some degree of stagnation, some degree of inflammation, some degree of dysbiosis, right? And
Absolutely.
our microbes do so much in terms of converting nutrients into different forms that allow us to actually absorb it. So, even when we're talking about mineral imbalances and giving isolated minerals, oftentimes the perceived deficiency or perceived excess is not even the root cause. It's just a symptom of something else going on in the body. Again, since glyphosate there's so much research on it, it's such a fascinating topic. It actually can cause, for example, manganese imbalance, right? It'll mess with certain enzyme systems in the liver that allow us to actually utilize manganese properly and will cause toxic forms, toxic oxide forms to accumulate in the liver and in the brainstem, not only impairing and damaging the liver, but then also contributing things like Parkinson's. And that's part of the mechanism of damage that it has. But, to answer your question, I mean, again, that's why I focus on the gut first and foremost, because if you're not absorbing your nutrients from your food, it's not really a solution to then just give isolated minerals on top of that. It's really about balancing the microbiome, which can be done in a variety of ways, purifying it, cleansing it of something that's known as mucoid plaque, something that you may have heard before, but people are not really sure exactly what it is. Is it a parasite? Is it a mucosal colony of all kinds of different things? But it is this weird ropey material that most people have in their guts, and most of my clients have told me they've excreted at some point in our journey working together, and they feel better after it comes out. And whatever it is, it's certainly very toxic and seems to be impairing with their nutrient absorption. So is it a parasite? Is it a big mucus thing? Quite frankly, don't know, but better out than in. So these are different ways of making sure that our gut is working properly and our liver, and our bile flow is working properly so we can actually absorb the nutrients from our food. More specifically, if we're going to talk about ways of remedying that, I do like certain binders for getting rid of pesticides and heavy metals out of the gut, and ammonia and biotoxins and all that kind of thing. So Zeobind is something I really like. That's a zeolite product from BioPure. It's a very specific kind of zeolite product that stays only in the gut. It doesn't go systemic. I think there's a big issue with systemic zeolites. The liquid zeolites, there's a lot of controversy as, does it cause aluminum toxicity? Does it not? But the stable forms, the ones that stay in the gut because they are not that small in particle size, those are dramatically effective for reducing detox reactions and binding to a variety of things without really impairing our nutrient status. Modified citrus pectin is another binder that I really like. That's just a phenomenal way to get started. And in terms of balancing the microbiome, a product I really, really love is Megaspore Biotic. It's a spore-based probiotic that, quite frankly, reconditions the gut microbiome. So it creates lasting effects. Most probiotics, when you take them, they only really work as they're going down the intestinal tract. But Megaspore will actually have spores that will hatch and then communicate with our microbes to help push pathogens out and increase microbial diversity. So, I've seen that be phenomenal for resolving food intolerances, for helping people actually start gaining weight when they haven't been able to gain weight for a long time, and reducing leaky gut related symptoms. So it's a handful of tools that I really like.
Super cool, man. Super cool. Well, you mentioned something earlier about heavy metals, and it was kind of in passing, but you said that heavy metals can actually alter or kind of create, I'm not sure the word that you used off the top of my head, but I'm going to try and paraphrase it just by saying like a synthetic consciousness. That is something that I'd really like to dive into with you because, within the alchemical paradigm, we tend to feel that metals are the least dynamic or the least complex of all of the different forms of creation, all of the different kingdoms of creation, but they're the most pure and they have pure form of consciousness. And especially when people hear about, taking metallic medicines within the alchemical corpus, a lot of people are like, oh, that's the thing. It's the hardest to make. It's the most intense. I want to take that. And I have actually seen people go crazy after taking purified metallic medicines in too large a dose and just trying to hit it way too hard with the typical kind of Western mindset of more is better. And these are medicines that have absolutely no, well, at least if they're crafted properly, have absolutely no metallic components in them whatsoever. We're talking about like oils of the metals, or we're talking about like quintessences of the metals or potable forms of them. But they end up they can really lose their shit. And I have a number of different stories, like firsthand accounts that I've seen of people that have really lost their shit. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more from the toxicity angle of having these heavy metals in the system and what you kind of tend to mean by how they alter consciousness.
Sure. Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. And it really goes to show the intricacies of alchemy as well, which, I really appreciate people like you bringing it back in a modern sense. It's so freaking cool to see.
Hmm,
I don't understand it at depth at all, so please correct me if I say anything that is not accurate to the alchemical tradition.
fair
But
enough.
um, in terms of like modern research, these heavy metals not only have a lot of documented effects on our physiology and the symptoms that they cause on a physical level, but they typically have a lot of psychological associations. So, a simple example is lead. When lead was added to gasoline and to paint, we had a massive rise over the next couple of decades in antisocial behavior, in criminal behavior, in ADHD, and a decrease in intelligence and IQ among children. And since it was never detoxified from the generation, it is something that is actually
Passed on.
still, yeah, it's still being passed down generation to generation at the bottom of the bucket for people, hidden deep in their bones typically. So lead, as far as I understand, right, is correlated with the planet Saturn.
Hmm.
And as far as I know, Saturn has a lot of associations with dullness and darkness and the real dark parts of society. And it's so interesting to see the correlation between lead as a metal, its toxicity, and the impact it has on people's behavior, and these more ancient roots in alchemy.
Totally.
um, Another example, like mercury. I mean, most people have heard about the story of the Mad Hatters, smelting
Yep.
mercury and them losing their minds with all the mercury vapor. Well, mercury has a lot of documented effects in how it impacts the brain as well in terms of personality. It's actually something known as erethism, right? So erethism is not just the mercury toxicity, but also refers to the psychological traits that people develop, which is typically shyness, timidity, uh, social anxiety, lack of self-confidence. And also what I've seen anecdotally is a lot of wacky thinking, a lot of disjointed, ungrounded, not well formed thoughts, right? And that's something I experienced firsthand. I didn't realize um, how warped my logic was, and how I saw the world until I actually detoxified a lot of that intracellular mercury that was passed down generationally. So this work really, really goes deep, I feel. But on a positive sense, the higher levels of the nutrients that we consider beneficial minerals like zinc and selenium have a lot of impacts in terms of positive personality traits. So levels of selenium are correlated not just with intelligence and creative thinking, but also feelings of joy and social ability, which, if you even see connections with what the word selenium comes from, Selene, right, which is the moon. The moon has a lot of associations with joy and social ability, right? Um, so what I found and what I see on a regular basis working with people is there is a toxic sludge that really weighs people down. It's like the light of the person wants to shine through, but there is just all this mud and musk over the lamp that's just blocking it from shining through, which is the toxins, which is not just the toxins, quite frankly, but it's also the emotional and mental baggage that people carry, um, probably beyond even just this lifetime, also from the family system and all that.
Sure.
And as one works on all levels and heals and brings harmony back to the system and brings the right minerals in and pushes the heavy metals and other toxins out, it's like the channel becomes clear, and there is a more pure expression and, quite frankly, flow states for the person to actually express who they really are. And that's something I experienced firsthand. And it's kind of crazy to think about that I didn't feel like myself for the first 24 years of my life. I didn't know who I was. I was just floating, what I perceived to be floating above my body and looking at things from like a I'm not really there perspective.
Yeah.
versus what it actually feels like to be really dialed into the moment and feel things deeply, to feel music deeply, to feel conversations with like-minded people deeply, to feel what it's like to look at a sunset and have that prana moving through you of just of awe. It's something I was foreign to me and didn't even realize the human body could enjoy. But it had a lot to do with, how clean was my vessel, right? Because ideally, if the vessel is clean and purified and balanced, then it's simple. You express yourself simply. But if you're toxic and filled with sludge and all this stuff, then things get real complicated. And there's so much neuroses and there's so much other baggage, quite frankly. So, yeah.
Totally, man. Totally. I mean, I think most people in the modern world are thinking very, very unclear. This was not a terribly popular stance, and I never said this to insult anybody, but there was a time where I was researching flat Earth theories for a long time because people kept throwing them at me and saying, your astrology is wrong. You got to take a look at this. People, even like Amanda Vollmer and other people, and saying, you got to take a look at your models. You got to take a look at your models. But they were unable to cognitively provide me with any form of decent mathematics because mathematics is kind of like the astral functions that we can demonstrate whether something works or not, and also leaving out a tremendous amount of other data that is also clearly observable. So it's like they'll take certain points, which are really just open-ended arguments more often than not, and present those and then say, see, do you see why you're wrong? And it's like, well, no, do you see why you're wrong? Why there's logical fallacies here like crazy. And if mathematics, if observation, and if common sense or critical thinking don't all line up together, then we don't have a holistic theory. And so over time, I stopped really looking into much of the theories that were being thrown my way because there were like 60 to 70 different individual theories and everybody saying, yeah, all these other guys are wrong. This is the right way. And this is, and it was like, okay, cool. I got to really find out what the lowest common denominator here is behind all of these. And every single flat earth person who sent me a theory, I asked them just for a photograph so that I could perform an IDF analysis of them. Every single one of them had huge levels of heavy metals in their central nervous system brain tissue. Every single one of them. That was the lowest common denominator of what I could find. Now, a lot of them also had nanoplastics and microplastics in central nervous system tissue, as well as in gut tissue and a number of other things. But I was quickly able to draw like, ooh, look at all these heavy metals, with mercury perhaps being the number one that we could see because it has an affinity for central nervous system tissue and it's really easy to get lodged there.
Mm.
So I thought that that was a really interesting thing, and that was not a very popular thing for me to say. In fact, it got me, kicked off of certain podcasts that people had interviewed me on multiple times and other things, and they were like, "Oh, he's discriminating against us, and he's just an idiot," whatever else, all the other things. But it's still something that I can see anytime that I take a look at large conspiratorial groups like Q, for instance. Same thing. If people try and tell me those things, I'll take a photo of them and just try and analyze what's going on. Same exact thing. High levels of heavy metals in neurological tissue. I think that when we take data and process it, but don't have the processing power to really get all of the data in there and moving, the brain can spit out some really interesting conclusions that maybe aren't wrong, but they're definitely interrupted. And that is one of the things that I've seen largely about a lot of different kind of kookier folk and ideas, because people aren't necessarily kooky. They come across as kooky, but the ideas can oftentimes be kooky. And sometimes that's a good thing. Like we need thinkers who are advanced. We need, but today there's such a huge amount of disinformation and misinformation and cognitive bias everywhere. It's like, for instance, if you are using Google or Yahoo, God forbid, for search engines, and you search something on there, you're only going to find what Google and Yahoo have interests in having you know, and largely this is any information that doesn't go towards main shareholder interest is just going to be completely um, abated. And so you're only going to be able to find certain amounts of information anyway. But then on top of that, we have all sorts of different types of folks saying all sorts of different types of things. And we have a populace that really doesn't have the computing processing power to be able to determine whether those things are true or not. And so most things, instead of being logical and being worked out and either proven for oneself or not, actually get relinquished to a realm of belief. And I think that we are suffering from a sociological mass delusion because so many people are subscribed to belief systems that determine what truth actually is or what it should be. And these are large, large groups of people now. It becomes an interesting phenomenon that I don't know that we've ever seen throughout history before because we've never lived in such a toxic world before. So anyway, that was just something that kind of came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, oh my God, it's really sad. I mean, we have some of the worst mental health ever, and it's absolutely tied into the toxic times that we live in. Um, yeah, really, really crazy to see. I mean, the heavy metals, the way they, one of the most common complaints I hear from people is erasing minds, you
Yeah.
know, and it's like they can't slow down, they can't find a still center within themselves. And if your mind's just bouncing around all the time, it's really easy to get ungrounded, quite frankly, especially if you get isolated and you start just watching things online repeatedly without coming back to a still center or feeling the earth, you know?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, man, so intensely. Like, yeah, those, and oftentimes those simple earth-based things are also the things that somebody feels ultimately disconnected from, or even disconnected from the ability to engage in when being overloaded with toxins. It's like the best you can do is to just sit down, oftentimes in front of the computer or TV or phone or whatever, and just kind of mindlessly scroll or watch something or kind of zone out to help take your mind off the intensity of the symptoms because there's
wow.
such a huge amount of inflammation from the cell membrane level on up, and it's like I don't have the energy to go outside to go for a walk. I don't have an energy to, like, be in nature, to take a drive to get there, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, it can be a real insane thing. Now,
Actually, pardon me before we go
yeah,
into the next
by all means.
question. I do want to make a little point on that. I would go a step beyond and even say that there's a certain resonance with technology and electromagnetic fields with the heavy metals in our cells. I mean, it's
Mm,
documented that the heavy metals will actually be rattled by the electromagnetic fields. And when you're in the person, if you're heavy metal toxic and you're around Wi-Fi, then it'll start shaking them up, and then they're starting to mess with different enzymes and they're starting to bounce around and cause more oxidative stress. But in a weird esoteric way, I feel like that's what keeps drawing people, quite frankly, back into technology. Because our, if we had a perfectly, in an ideal world, perfectly well balanced mineral complex within us that is in harmony with nature, we would seek to connect with nature above technology. But since there's so much toxicity and heavy metals that resonate with these electromagnetic fields, it's like people are more easily drawn to this already addictive technology. So yeah, I mean, pretty crazy stuff. That's what I.
but that's a really fascinating point, and something that actually I think we need to take a look at as to even what is driving our technology. It's been well known for quite some time now that a lot of people that classify themselves or are now being diagnosed as neurodivergent have the same types of heavy metal toxins and have decreased glutathione pathways in their cells that actually contribute to, especially in their neurons, right? There's brain cells and nerve cells that actually contribute to this development of how can I retreat further into technology? How can I take technology further, further, further? And it also seems to be that within places like Silicon Valley, California, and other places that are tech driven, that there's a huge percentage, like probably 50 to 60% or more of the individuals are diagnosed as being neurodivergent. So we're seeing that there is this enormous kind of trend that kind of validates a lot of what you were just saying, is like there's a sympathetic resonance there between the toxicities and the development even of technologies. And we have to determine at some point, is all of this development that we're doing really beneficial, or is it just development for the sake of development? I would argue that it's the latter, that people are just developing for the sake of development and finding ways to capitalize off of that, because there's enough people out there that are like, yeah, it's much easier for me to engage in an AI conversation that is not going to criticize me no matter how I am, versus having a conversation with a normal person who, or a regular human individual who is going to oftentimes give me some criticism for the strange behaviors that I exude. And that comes down to, I don't want anything to be wrong with me, so don't point out what's wrong with me type of social attitude that's going on. And that's especially rampant in schools right now. You know, we're seeing all these like hyper sensitive generation being like, don't tell me what's wrong with me. Don't tell me what's wrong with me, unless it's a diagnosis that allows them to use that as a scapegoat and say, well, I'm neurodivergent, ergo, you can't treat me like this, or I identify as this thing, and you are unable to say anything about it without being a major sociological villain now.
Wow.
Um,
Well, if I may on that too, that's
please.
super. It just to contemplate like what a metal even is. Let's just look at like a piece of stainless steel or copper wire, or let's just say, I mean, most metal is going to be rigid, right?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
also going to be a phenomenal electrical conductor. So to apply those qualities to a lot of these people who are so sensitive and so rigid in their beliefs and the way they approach the world, and yet their minds are electric and flying around all over the place in all sorts of scattered kind of attention behaviors and thoughts and all that kind of thing, versus, if we have more of the natural flexible forms of minerals like zinc, right? Most people are insanely zinc deficient, and zinc,
Yeah.
if you actually add it to an alloy, will make the metal more flexible.
Yeah.
So I just kind of, I think it all resonates on different levels, it mirrors itself.
I think, yeah, exactly. Like, we would be able to take a look at the properties of the metals individually, like zinc, for instance, or potassium or magnesium or whatever, and take a look at their use, particularly like you were talking about in alloys and in other things, and take a look at the way that they behave, and then take a look at them inside of the context of a biological organism where they're needed the most. And then we can see the malleability. Like, for instance, zinc in the human body tends to accumulate in the largest quantities inside of the liver, for
Mhm.
instance. The liver is one of the only organs, like you were talking about, that has this supreme malleability to it, where it can take abuse like you can't even imagine and still bounce back from it and even regenerate. Whereas other organs with lesser qualities of zinc are completely incapable of doing that. So we can begin to see that there are direct one-to-one correlations between what we might refer to as the physical and somewhat metaphysical properties, or to even take it out of this realm of metaphysics, we would just refer to it as kind of its more energetic or subtle energetic properties of the human organism. So yeah, brilliant awareness there, Kyle. It's really cool to see that.
Likewise.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm curious. One of the things that I've around the same topic, one of the things that I've seen in almost all of my clients is severe plastic toxicity, such to the degree that, I remember reading a study quite recently that was showing that every male has tested for micro and nanoplastics in their penis and testicles, regardless of age, regardless of like where they were at around the world, and so on and so forth. And they wrote that article specifically and showed that test because they've seen it in brain tissue, they see it in kidney tissue, they see it in bone tissue, they see it everywhere distributed throughout the body. So it's not just in the reproductive system. but they felt that men would finally choose to do something about it if they knew that it was in their penis and their testicles.
That's a big.
Which is probably true. I think the vast majority of them would be like, nope, fuck that, game over now.
Oh yeah.
But the question really is, how are you addressing, or are you addressing plastic toxicity, or is it just kind of the same generalized thing of like utilize binders, utilize the right types of mineral balance to create the resistance so that we're not getting intracellular and intratissue plastic toxicities, and then avoiding plastics as much as reasonably possible?
That's a great question. Yeah, obviously the exposures is huge, and that applies to everything. I mean, there should really be a sweep done in the house and your daily habits as to like what you are exposing yourself to, even if it's not outright causing insane amounts of damage now, but drinking out of plastic water bottles every day will
Yep.
eventually contribute to that plastic overload. Um, yeah, so I believe there's a hierarchy in terms of what should be addressed because it's really easy to get overwhelmed in terms of what a person should focus on. Um, and I've just generally found that if you detoxify some of the more damaging things like fluoride, aluminum, mercury, lead, glyphosate, atrazine, these kind of things,
Yeah.
then a person's gut, liver, and lymphatics work better, and they are able to then detoxify everything a lot better to the 87,000 unknown and known chemicals in the environment.
Totally.
But I feel like if you address those ones that seem to cause the absolute most damage and impair our antioxidant systems the most and our drainage pathways the most, everything else flows out a lot better. Now, directly on the plastics, there's certain binders that do have good research on binding to plastics, like zeolites and chlorella. Those are two great ones. Of course, I'm going to caution everyone listening that the quality and sourcing matters unbelievably when it comes to binders, just because there are so many, poorly made, already toxic products, just trying to capitalize on the hype. So as far as I know, the only chlorella I trust right now is by BioPure. It's formulated by Dr. Klinghardt as well. And then Zeobind in terms of zeolite. Those are the only two I really trust right now.
That's cool. Yeah, no, let's talk about that because for quite a while now, I've been utilizing a company called Touchstone Essentials. They have an advanced daily cell detox that is a nano particulate clinoptilolite.
Okay.
I always have a hard time spelling or pronouncing that if I don't see it spelled in front of me. But yeah, it's like a nano clinoptilite zeolite type of thing.
Mhm.
So with that being said, I tend to feel that that is a really good one to work at the cellular level. But I would agree that most zeolite products oftentimes have adulterations or things with it too. But you had mentioned earlier that, for you, there's a concern about these nano-sized particles, and there's definitely some debate, like, are they contributing to aluminum toxicity and other things? Zeolite should be an aluminosilicate, but in that mineral form, we shouldn't have those types of toxins. What, if you don't mind going into the detail of what your concern with some of those things might be? I think that'd be interesting for me to hear, and definitely probably for some of my listeners as well.
For sure. So I don't know the company you're referring to, and I'd love to look into it because there are some companies doing it right. I've generally found nano zeolites are not as easily tolerated, so you have to have some level of robust health because they do mobilize quite a lot from the cells and from the tissues, considering they are nanos. But the concern about, again, so the structure of zeolite and most clays really, but zeolite specifically is aluminum silicate, but it's the ratio of aluminum to silica that really matters, right? So there's certain zeolites on the market that have a really low ratio of aluminum to silica. And that may not necessarily be too much of a problem if you're keeping it in its pure form. But if you then micronize it, or if you make it nano-sized, or what some companies are doing, actually just making a lab created zeolite, you may not have that structural integrity to keep the aluminum and the silica together. And so the concern among some doctors in this kind of detoxification community is the benefit that people experience from nano zeolites, some of them, I don't know about this company. Again, I would love to look into it, is that they are detoxifying a lot of things, but then they are accumulating aluminum over a long term. And aluminum is already a one of the absolutely most important things for people to address. Again, I have done a lot of hair tests in my time, and there has not been a single person who has not shown high aluminum. And the reasons for that is, and not, I'm not even going to say it's conspiratorial, it's just fact. There is a geoengineering program going on where there is a spraying of the skies with metallic particles like aluminum and barium. A lot of evidence to support that, considering aluminum and barium is very high levels in the air, in the snow, in the rain, in the trees, in the soil. It's everywhere, and it's in people. And this isn't just regular aluminum. This is nano-sized aluminum, right? So it's
Yeah.
aluminum that goes straight through into the lungs, into the most sensitive tissues, into the brain. And aluminum is well correlated with, on one end, Alzheimer's, and on the other end, autism. So in between, you have all kinds of dysfunction going on for the brain for people who are just living normal lives. And for something to potentially contribute to an increased aluminum burden in an already highly saturated aluminum toxic environment is a risk I personally don't like to take with my clients. There isn't good enough research done on it. I would love for people to do more research on these individual products to see if they are actually reducing the aluminum in the tissues or not. There is another product I know called Zeocharge that claims to have done their own research. And that one does go systemic. It's a micronized zeolite. It's not a nano, but it's a micronized zeolite. And they did some studies measuring the heavy metals. I believe they used hair, and I believe they used blood as well. And they did find a reduction in aluminum using their product. So the right zeolites can actually be an aluminum binder because of the levels of silica in it, but not all of them. The concern is the lab made ones that are not coming from volcanoes. They are just
Yeah.
forcing together
Yeah.
aluminum.
Synthesized. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a big potential issue. But the thing is, if you reduce aluminum in the body, which is so already toxic for people, and it's such a dangerous mitochondrial poison as well, you have a reduction in toxicity of everything else, because there is actually a synergy that goes on between these environmental exposures. There's a study done with, for example, mercury and aluminum, and their LD50s and their LD1s on rats, right? So, LD, lethal dose, right? One is going to be the amount of a poison it takes to kill 1 out of 100 rats in a nutshell,
Yes.
right? So they took the LD1, so kills 1 out of 100 rats of mercury, and they took the LD1 of aluminum, right? 1 out of 100 rats of aluminum. When they combined the LD1 of mercury and the LD1 of aluminum together, it was an LD100. It killed all the rats. And that's the synergy of toxicity is huge. And that is actually, again, going back to why there's a hierarchy of toxins to address. Because if you reduce the levels of mercury, aluminum, fluoride, glyphosate, and these other really pervasive ones that pretty much everyone is being exposed to, then the potential interactions and toxicity of everything else being exposed to is greatly reduced, and you give the body a better fighting chance to not just survive these toxic times, but to actually thrive and maintain a homeostasis. So, yeah, hope that wasn't too much of a tangent, but
No, dude, I think that was absolutely great. The other thing that comes to mind is that for many, many, many years, people have been typically people who drink their own homegrown nettle teas and who drink their own horsetail teas from typically wild harvested clear stream sources. They tend to have lower aluminum levels naturally. There have been a couple of interesting tests that were done on that back in the 90s. And what I find to be interesting about that is that both of those are bioaccumulators of silica. So it stands to reason that organic forms of silica and silicic acid in particular, in its acidic form, I think is the most important thing, is that when that comes into contact with various aluminums that could be distributed in blood or organic tissue, they can actually help to bind to that by creating an aluminosilicate inside of the system. So that's really interesting. And again, silica being one of the most important of the cell salts as well.
Yeah.
Um,
I would love to say something on that briefly, actually.
please,
Yeah.
please.
Horsetail tea is one of the best ways to actually detoxify aluminum. It's one of the most generally tolerated. So that's phenomenal that you bring that up. I absolutely love that as a healing tool. And it's just interesting because aluminum isn't something that's found in isolation in nature. It's always found in a complex with silica and maybe other minerals as well. And so we're essentially remedying a modern problem by bringing it back to its original.
An ancient solution, you know.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
which I think that in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that at least that I focus on are definitely about all of that. It's like utilizing things from the past to bring it into modern context. Same thing, like one of the things, and there's still no research behind this. This is just something that I have found works in order to help people to ground out from excessive electromagnetic toxicities from exposure. I'll use white oak bark.
Mm,
And I came up with that whole concept because white oak in particular, well, all pretty much all oaks will do this, but white oak in particular has an affinity for lightning. When lightning strikes, they hit oak trees disproportionately more, whether they're tall or not. It used to be said that oak trees were so much taller than the other trees that that's why they would get struck. Well, in a forest where the maple trees and the oak trees and everything else are all about the same size in these non-old growth forests, we're still seeing a disproportionate amount of lightning strikes hitting the oaks. And there's this interesting synergy that they have ecologically where the oak actually is able to handle and direct that lightning strike without dying and
mm,
transmit it into the soil that the fungi thing can then use in order to help to provide greater electrical resistance and vitality to the rest of the forest around it. And so white oak bark is used as a bitter and as an astringent typically. And I started producing a spagyric tincture of it to see, would this be something that can help ground people out from the electromagnetic stresses that they have in the same way that the oak itself helps to ground this out from stray electricity in the environment during lightning storms? The
phenomenal.
answer that I have come to is absolutely yes, absolutely yes. So, you know, I think that we keep finding that nature always has a way of rectifying itself and it's constantly undergoing these processes.
Mm,
But to go back to you know, chemtrail issue, you know, recently, so pretty recently in the last like 6 months, people came out and said, oh yes, geoengineering is a thing and we are pumping, you know, like here in the United States, and especially here in the state of Utah, they are putting out silver iodide like fucking crazy in order to bring moisture into desert states. And
mm,
so Utah, a huge portion of our income comes from tourism because of our ski mountains. And as a result of, you know, however you want to call it, climate change or just generally changing shit as a result of the weakening of our magnetosphere,
yep.
really what it comes down to. Um, Weather patterns have changed considerably. Plus, we're also cutting off groundwater. We're deforesting and defielding, you know, just like open fields that were able to receive water. Now they're huge concrete and asphalt jungles essentially. So the groundwater isn't able to make its way in, which means that there's going to be a disruption of the water anyway. Well, since 1954, Utah has been pumping silver iodide particles into the atmosphere in order to create a dust that then cloud and moisture will be attracted to and then condense once it hits that dust. And this disrupts the entire natural cycle. Like dust naturally just by ruminant animals, by humans, by carts, by moving around a dirt road. You know, if we didn't have paved roads and things, there'd be dust flying up all the time. And some of these dusts are a little more dense and they settle down on trees and flowers and lower things and whatever else. Others of them, though, are kind of nanoparticleized. They're a lighter bit of dust and they continue to spread up and get into the atmosphere. And trees have been using this for thousands of years. There are these chemicals called mykists, 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 that we can detect as a hormone, but we can also detect them electromagnetically on the infrared spectrum. And they bind to these dust particles and move with wind currents to other areas, that tell, they're basically signals from the trees that tell trees in other areas, like in the Pacific Northwest and other heavily forested areas that traditionally have plenty of moisture, to exhale and to transpirate their moisture and to draw moisture in. And so by creating, first of all, by eliminating the dusts and, being obsessed with sterile streets and asphalt and cutting off the groundwater supplies and getting rid of the trees and getting rid of all these things, we're disrupting just the amount of mucus that can be there in the first place.
Mm.
But then we're synthesizing dust primarily as silver iodide that is coming in and it's allowing moisture to precipitate here. But silver and iodine are both massively antibiotic and antifungal.
Mm.
And iodine, to a certain degree, potassium iodide in particular, is great for radiation. But when we have silver iodide, it's actually enhancing the radioactive qualities of things. And so the soil that this water falls on has all of these silver and iodide components that are destroying all of the microorganisms, like completely obliterating them and creating all of our forests to be much more susceptible to like droughts and other things, because they're not in the same types of colony forming units that they would be in an otherwise healthy system.
Wow.
The point that I want to talk about that is that when we are drinking these waters that are coming from the rain, because all of the water that comes here really is circulated through rain, whether we're talking about what's in a river, a lake, a pond, an aquifer, whatever, it all comes from rain, just various levels of filtration.
Mm.
And then getting treated, unfortunately, by, cities and municipalities. And then people are drinking in these silver iodide particles as well, and ending up destroying their own gut microbiome. And we see that the exact same types of things that are happening ecologically are also happening in the body ecology as well. And I think really the only way that we can get back to completely healthy body ecology is not through more technology, because technology was the creation of all of these synthesized solutions that created the problems anyway, but really to get back to nature and to avoid utilizing the technologies that created these issues in the first place. I think it's really
Wow.
important for us to
That's
look at these things.
that's really profound. I mean, yeah, we're perfect, a perfect mirror of, the world around us and nature, and how what we do to it is exactly what we're doing to ourselves. And, the fact that you said silver iodide is an antifungal as well, I just can't imagine how it's disrupting the mycelium colonies. And
Exactly.
that's the communication network. That's like the big neuron that
Yeah.
of a tree is. And imagine how that's impacting us. And really, that's like the sense of connection a forest can have with itself. Imagine how people are feeling disconnected in their own lives with
Oh,
people
yeah.
around them, and what life really should be about, which is feeling connected. So really fascinating stuff.
Well, another thing is, like, for many, many millennia now, there have been Taoist practices of like communicating with a tree, and even Stephen Herod Buhner ended up writing some books about how to be able to enhance your heart field to come into contact with plants and trees and other things like that, and to learn to communicate with them. And also, he was doing this with kind of an idea of you communicate with it, but when you do that, it tells you what its medicinal properties are. Well, just like we have so many different types of toxic individuals these days that are incapable of, say, maintaining eye contact, or incapable of holding a conversation without being completely neurologically stressed out and frazzled, I'm finding that a lot of plants and trees and other materials like that are what we might refer to as being on the neurodivergent spectrum as well. And a big part of me has wondered, is it because we're destroying their neurology through aluminum, barium, strontium, through actual chemtrail poisons, as well as through the silver iodide thing that is absolutely destroying the possibility for healthy colonies of fungi to exist, or at least weakening them very drastically. So yeah, I think it goes hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah, stuff goes deep.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it
honestly,
really does,
I
man.
really, I mean, just to say the most out there thing yet today, why not?
Yeah, well, this is a great place for it.
I feel like, if I were just to theorize what is going on, um, we have throughout millennia, many cultures have had their myths, their epics of battles between good and evil.
Yeah,
And these are very symbolic tales, but I don't feel like in today's world it's as obvious the forces of evil, right,
yeah,
versus good. It's kind of all blends together unless you really take a step back and try to put all the pieces together. And when you see the way that aluminum and EMFs and the technology and the way we're damaging the environment, all this seems to be like a sort of foreign consciousness trying to blanket the earth with its mineral complexes, its consciousness, and subtly infiltrate human beings as well to make it more like it. Really, really weird to think about because it's almost like a battle against cybernetic evil, and it feels
yeah.
very alien because I mean even today people feel like freaking aliens. Honestly,
They
they
do,
don't
yeah,
feel, they're so disconnected and disjointed from the earth itself. It's like, well, what are they connected to then? And
yeah,
when you see everything working together, like the research on EMFs opening up the blood brain barrier and allowing things to flow into it, or how, the research of Dr. Stephanie Seneff, when glyphosate meets aluminum, it'll actually form a novel complex not found anywhere in nature, a glyphoaluminum complex. And it has one target, the pineal glands. The pineal gland, which is so sacred to everyone in spiritual culture, right?
yeah.
Spiritual traditions. And there's so many things that actually impact that specific gland, the electromagnetic fields, the blue light, the fluoride, all that. And quite frankly, I think that's like a key point of people feeling disconnected from something higher, from, the cosmos at large, and being in harmony with the cosmos, not just with the earth itself. Uh, so yeah, I mean, it's a really spiritual battle, I feel. And I think spiritual evolution today isn't really just about, meditating your way to some nirvana. I think it's about as becoming as embodied and connected to the earth as possible, and yet keeping as pure of a vessel as possible so you can stay connected to the cosmos and your higher power. And it's really not just about, the spiritual practice doesn't just stop with your meditations, it's your day-to-day habits, and it's about keeping yourself pure and clean and detoxified and well nourished. It's really all part of your sadhana, your discipline. So
Too true, man. Too true. Well, since we're going down this road, let's add another layer to this from my research that I think kind of dovetails with this and is really interesting. When we talk about, you were talking about a battle in traditional mythos, like whether we're talking about like the wars between gods and men, or whether we're talking about like mythological gods and titans, or all of these different types of things. One of the things that might make this a little bit more relevant is the way that in Aurelian medicine, how we define an entity. We define an entity as any electromagnetic signature that is aware of itself. And so when we talk about demons, or when we talk about interdimensional entities, or when we talk about ancestral entities or other things, we're not talking about this thing that like looks and acts like a ghost the way that it's been kind of talked about on TV and shown on like all it's like this kind of nebulous thing for most people. For us, it's just an electromagnetic signature, and these electromagnetic signatures love to be in other electromagnetic signatures that they essentially draw their energy from. So like demons love the type of electromagnetic signature that generates and perpetuates fear and crisis and suffering. Whereas other interdimensional entities, depending on the classification of them, can enjoy things like depression, anxiety, um, deprivation, disconnection, different types of negative emotional states. There are some people now who are out there saying like there's a war, a spiritual war happening on this planet at this time. And the way that I see that through my own research is Well, if I were to say that there is a war between interdimensional entities or demons or whatever else for the human soul, whatever that is, I'd say it's more for the body than the soul. But still, I could say that there are definitely electromagnetic signatures that are aware of themselves and aware of their feeding capacity that are able to enter into people when they do things that, one, transgress their own conscience. That is kind of like, that's you go against your own inner Jiminy Cricket, and now you have let some sort of permutation of negativity into your space. If you never allow yourself to go down a particular road that you know is bad, you never have to like backtrack, you never have to like get off that road. A lot of people though have had, a lot of different types of experiences, whether it's rebelling against religion that was forced upon them or whatever else, that in an attempt to find their own sovereignty actually did transgress their own conscience because they confused what their own conscience was with a morality that was imposed upon them. And that can open up a person to some really negative things. But then we also talk about, say, aluminum and different types of electromagnetic technologies, whether that be the phone or whether that be video games, or whether that be whatever the case is, that is feeding and creating these emotional states of resonance that are ideal for a lot of these negative or harmful entities that we see within the subcategory of Aurelian pathology called ens veneni, or the causation of toxins, and also ens spirituale, which is causation of spirits or spiritual causation. And so I'm seeing this all the time in my clients and seeing how they have tremendous amounts of these entity like signatures inside of their intrinsic data field that just need to be cleaned right the fuck out in order to regain some semblance of humanity. And oftentimes when we do that, they're like, oh my God, I can breathe again and I can think again. And then it's like, okay, but your first line of defense still needs to be get out into nature, don't transgress your own conscience, stay toxin free. Otherwise, you're going to ultimately end up becoming a channel for this again.
Wow. Well,
So,
that is so crazy because it's absolutely gets married with the another issue that's huge with people is the parasite problem.
yes,
I mean, these entities are feeding off, you, and the
yes,
parasites feed off you. But what is so weird about it is if you look at, a lot of the biological research on parasites themselves, they are actually pollution sinks. They are the life forms that are literally the embodiment of toxicity because they are accumulating and globbing onto all the
all the
garbage
toxins.
that's
Yeah.
going on. Yeah, they're the bottom feeders, right? So in fish, for example, in polluted rivers, if you measure the heavy metals in their tissue versus the parasites often have actually hundreds of times higher levels of heavy metals than the fish, which is crazy to think about because then at that point, they're actually serving a sort of symbiotic role for the fish to handle the onslaught of toxicity. But
Bingo.
they create this consciousness that is then feeding off the fish, right?
Yeah.
Which is so crazy. But then there's the misguided approach of waging war against oneself and not loving oneself, because a lot of people in the alternative health community think the answer is to take antifungals, antiparasitics, and antimicrobials because they need to kill the bad guys. But really, they just re-poison themselves with the impurities that these things are holding on. So
Totally.
huge issue. But what's freaky to me is the parasites have such a deep interconnection to our psychology, and the biotoxins they release will change a person's behavior, the way they think, the way they feel, the way they interact with people, and actually even cause them to act kind of like parasites, as bizarre as that sounds, where they don't respect other people's boundaries, where they take more than they give. And it's just because of what's going on to them on a deeper level. But at the bottom of the bucket is still the environmental pollution,
Yes.
because you cannot balance this issue out and cleanse these foreign creatures until you have actually changed the terrain within yourself to be a hospitable host for a higher
Yeah,
power,
the
really.
beneficial microbes and other things that are going to produce your enzymes and coenzymes and critical factors and other things like that that are going to help and support a healthy body and neurology as opposed to the other one. Yeah, man. Yeah, within Aurelian medicine, we show that same thing. And I didn't know where I stood for a long time on this. I was reading terrain theory documents. I was reading other things. It took a long time to actually compile enough data where I can take a look at it and say, okay, regardless of whatever bias I might have, if I take a look at the data objectively, it paints a very clear picture. And the picture that it seems to paint is parasites do not stay inside of a healthy system, period. If they don't have heavy metals and plastics and dioxins and petroleum toxins and these other different types of classifications of modern toxicities, they don't stay inside the system because it's an inconducive environment for their proliferation. And I oftentimes will talk to my clients and say, like, look, man, like most of these guys are miners and trash workers, all of these parasites. Their whole job is to find heavy metals and start decomposing them slowly. But the problem isn't that the parasite is necessarily there and doing that. The problem is that in order to do that, they also need welfare. And they are taking all of this welfare money from the rest of your body, leaching calcium from the bone system and interrupting parathyroid recalciumization processes. And we're also doing all sorts of other, leaching of amino acids and other building blocks that are important to us while simultaneously defecating in our system. And when they do that, they create acids and other different types of complexes that are foreign to the system that create harmful chemicals as opposed to beneficial ones that we're not ideally suited for. And so what happens behind them? Well, then the fungi come in right behind them because fungi are like, oh, hey, there's some weird acid toxicities. I know how to take care of those. Same with archaea. They come in, they start to decompose these things, and now you have a fungal infection. You have candidiasis, you have mollisetia, you have, just unreasonable amounts of different types of fungal colonies in the bloodstream, in various tissues. And then behind them, the bacteria, smaller bacteria end up coming in and smaller archaea come in and try and decompose those things. But now you have 3 different classifications, or at least 3 to 4 different classifications of foreign pathogenic wastes that if the bacteria and fungi, because Candida is supposed to be in a healthy digestive organism, a healthy microbiome, Mollisetia is as well, all of these, but in a smaller colony. And in those smaller colonies, they produce smaller amounts of these different types of acids, which help actually to detoxify the body when kept in check. But when there's too much work and they're overloaded and they're stressed and having to do this job that the other microbes can't do, then they're excreting so much of this extra waste inside of the body that itself is also becoming toxic. And so it's like, the parasites, the bacteria, the fungi, the archaea that are in the system and going out of balance are there to help the condition and trying to their very hardest, doing a very thankless job. And then oftentimes they're the same ones that are being villainized and being killed and erupting even more toxicity, like you were saying, into the system, which then brings them back in again. It's this people who end up going on allopathic antifungals or pharmaceutical antifungals, oftentimes have to take them over and over and over again. It's like a cyclical pattern. Same thing with the antibiotics. It's like, just learn that streptococcus is not the thing that is creating the infection. The thing that is creating the infection are materials that are bringing in too much heat, as we would classify them within Chinese medicine. It's like too much this fire element. And so they're there to try and help to clean up that damage. But they shouldn't, especially parasites, most parasites, with the exception of a couple of amoeba, are not native to the human microbiome. They do not belong there. They were invited there basically by the amount of toxicity that's there. And that creates this entire terrible pathogenic cascade that is a very slippery slope for most people, especially if they abide by the germ theory approach of just basically nuke the environment and then see what happens.
Wow, that's so crazy. I mean, to think how that's reflecting in our culture, though. I mean, where, yeah, there's people that have ways of viewing the role of government and how it should be and how it should be handouts and welfare versus empowering contribution to the rest of society, making you a node in a beautiful network of society where you're giving and receiving in a way that is completely relevant for you specifically and the rest of the world versus just taking, taking out of balance. And it's pretty mind-boggling to me. I do want to briefly say though, there is an afterthought. There is a space for cleansing the pathogens, just like there is a space
Totally.
for
Yeah.
arresting criminals in society, right?
Yep.
Or pulling weeds from a garden. Because once you have already changed the terrain, there's some ones that don't want to leave and they want to stick around, whether it's Lyme spirochetes or a tapeworm or liver flukes or whatever, they're no longer relevant to the system. Then that's the time to cleanse them. But it's never a first, even second or third step in a process. It's typically an afterthought. At least that's what I've found.
No, that is for me too. Everybody will be like, are you going to get rid of these things? Are you going to get rid of them? And there's actually a time and a place for that. Like if somebody's body is so overridden with these different creatures that no matter how much nutrition I'm capable of giving them, the critters, so to speak, are taking more of them, then I will actually try to address those first and get it to a manageable level again before trying to take on, digestive system. For me, it always works with organs, tissues, cells, work in that order. And it's always stomach, small intestine, colon, liver, kidneys, spleen, always in that order for me. And then I can go into the cells and I can get rid of the intracellular toxins, get rid of the intracellular parasites, which there are a couple of amoeba, like Polypodium is actually one of them, but
I'll say Lyme spirochetes are a big issue for people.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. Hey, curious, what is your perspective actually on Lyme spirochete and Lyme disease? Because I've been able to see that, for instance, the spirochetes, the bacteria that are said to be responsible for Lyme, Borrelia burgdorferi.
Yeah.
When we find individuals and we tried to eliminate all of those bacteria initially, the people still had Lyme disease.
Yeah.
And they were still showing all of the symptoms. So I'm curious what your own perspective is on this. Do you also feel that it is kind of like emotional toxins compounded with physical toxins that create the susceptibility to things like Lyme and also Epstein-Barr virus like symptoms? Or do you find that it's actually, spirochete bacterial issues?
I think the reality is a little darker in this specific topic. So a lot of because Lyme disease was part of my journey and something I was diagnosed with by different practitioners and some of the symptoms I was showing and whatnot, but it wasn't the direct solution. It wasn't the thing to go after, right? But a lot of this I've learned admittedly from Dr. Klinghardt. So full respect to that brilliant mind who has done so much for the Lyme disease community. Now, what it seems to be, you can find Lyme spirochetes in cavemen, right? And there is a European Lyme that is very mild and often asymptomatic for people. And then there's an American Lyme that is absolutely devastating, virulent, completely can ruin a person's life. And, through his experiments, he was doing genomic sequencing on these Lyme spirochetes, and he found that, caveman Lyme, or the one in Europe, had about 20 genes, which is already very complex for these kind of spirochetes, right? The American Lyme had over 800 genes.
That's very complex, though.
So there's good reason to think that this is a biological weapon that was somehow released on the public, whether by accident or intentionally. That's how it got its name, from Lyme, Connecticut. So it's quite a rabbit hole to research. I won't get too deep into it, but because of that, it makes it a very big problem for people who already have weakened systems. It can be the nail in the coffin for certain, cases with already a lot of dysfunction and a lot of toxicity and all that. But even with that kind of craziness about that situation, it still goes back to terrain and, how mineralized you are and how toxic you are, because aluminum is shown to be a growth factor for these spirochetes.
Yeah.
Aluminum toxic patients will have significantly higher levels of parasites and Lyme spirochetes. So it isn't something to go after directly, but it is something that maybe can be considered further down the line. And by then, typically people already have gotten rid of most of their symptoms.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
some of my research around that, just as a quick talking point, also indicates that the sensation of fear of nature is what actually brings on the susceptibility to Lyme infection, Lyme
Wow.
disease infection in the first place. Is like when people are afraid of being exposed to the sun, for instance, when people are afraid of going out into the woods, when people are afraid, and when they hold those states of fear in nature, it's almost like a direct magnet to like, okay, this individual, this needs to be taken care of. When we can clear out those states of fear, typically the susceptibility, even just in all of my clinical trials over here, when we just address the biological conflicts within the context of German New Medicine that deal with fear, we call them fear conflicts, and there's a number of different ones. Once we clear those out, the symptom of Lyme disease, whether we have addressed spirochete levels, whether we've addressed other toxins or not, drops by about 50% in every single one of the clinical trials that we have.
Wow.
So I think that that is also an important thing, is to recognize how emotional toxicity plays into a lot of these things too. Like when we're told like, oh, don't go into the forest because, don't go mushroom hunting because, don't do this. We tend to get this feeling of like, okay, in the city we're safe because there's very few things that are out to get us, and then when we're out in nature we're not safe. We have no real protection there. All bets are off. When people feel that way, oftentimes it seems like that's part of the terrain that is like, you're an eligible candidate for Lyme disease today, because I've been bit by tons of ticks, but I'm out in nature all the freaking time. I mean, ever since I was little, it's like always out, always being bit by ticks. Get those little bastards out. No real conditions. But then again, I don't have a fear actually of being out in nature. And in fact, I tend to embrace it and feel more at home in nature than I do in a city environment. I think most people do. For me, I was like 16 years old, took a handful of mushrooms hanging out in Fernwood Forest. 6 7 hours go by, I'm getting ready to go home and begrudgingly like walking back to my car, and then I look out as soon as I exit the forest, and there's just a huge sprawling city and bright lights, and I just remember thinking to myself like, this is not the way humans are meant to be living and interacting. Like, this whole environment is so completely distanced and foreign from nature. It just feels like a complete atrocity. And yeah, I think a lot of other people are kind of awakening to that same realization, or have already had that same realization for a long time. Now we just have to do something about it, really. So
It's
what to do,
happening.
how to get together on the same page, because there's so many different stances and so many different takes about what should be done or what could be done. That
I
yeah,
think though, once everyone understands what the root causes are, I think the solutions appear by themselves.
hey, I think you're right, though. I definitely think you're right.
Wow. Wow,
So
thank you so much, man. What a conversation.
yeah, man. Yeah, this has been an absolutely great one. I feel like we could keep going on and on and on, but I am coming to the end of my time here today. So I wanted to go ahead and turn it over to you. I want you to let our listeners know where they can find you. What maybe upcoming things do you have going on? Are you taking on clients? Any of that type of information, please go ahead and let our listeners know.
Absolutely. So you can find me in my work at jyotimb.com or jyotimineralbalancing.com. Either link works. So this is JYOTI mineralbalancing.com. There I write articles on different topics, and you could also find me at Instagram. So at Kyle_Peche, Peche. There again, I'm making videos, I'm making posts, I'm on doing different long form content as well. So this is all, yeah, there you go. Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. So you can find me there. I do take one-on-one clients. it's the way I feel I can best offer service, because I think, quite frankly, healing is very complicated sometimes for people. And I think you need a mentor and a guide to help you navigate the jungle of holistic healing. I don't think it's a do it yourself thing for many people. So I do take one-on-one clients. You could always just reach out through my website and inquire. I'd love to chat, or at least help point you in the right direction. Um, so yeah, that's about it. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, man. Thank you again so much. I feel like we could wrap on topics related to this for a long time. So we'll definitely send an invite next season and have you come back on. Hopefully by then you'll have some new crazy and interesting information we can just spin off and go down some crazy roads, I'm sure.
So
So
I'd be honored.
awesome, Kyle. Well, again, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our listeners who are out there. If you enjoyed this interview, if you found it valuable, please be sure to like, subscribe. Be sure to share this with people, though, more than anything. Almost all of us know people who are dealing with toxicity, and there are lots of different ways of going about handling these toxicities in the modern era. And we need to be able to find practitioners that we feel resonate with our own needs and with our own journeys and other things like that. Kyle is one of those great folks out there that has an abundance of resources. So please be sure to check out his site. Please be sure to check out his work. Spread the word about what he's doing and provide this to as many people as you can, because this is something that is, if I had to say that an actual pandemic existed, the actual pandemic that exists is toxicity. We're dealing with it worldwide, and it's something that we all need to be able to address. So again, if you like this, please be sure to share it with people that you feel this information will be useful and applicable to. And again, thank you guys so much, and we'll catch you for our next episode of the Alchemiculture Podcast. Again, I've been your host, Phoenix Aurelius, with our guest, Kyle Peche. Thanks again, Kyle.
Thank you so much.